Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhage.
Our interview last week was so good that we decided to turn it into a two-part series. If you missed last week, you'll find the link in the show notes. It's not mandatory that you listen, but we want to make sure that you don't miss out on this amazing conversation. Hi, everyone. It's Roxanne Derhage. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Today, I have an amazing woman that I spent some time with in Rome at the WIN conference. And she was on the main stage talking about female leadership. Her name is Wendelijn. Wendelijn, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to see and hear you again.
So Wendelijn caught my attention because, as you know, I talk a lot about female leadership and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. But she's a historian and a female leadership expert based in the Netherlands. And what captivated me when she spoke was, the history about not just female leadership, but really as societies, what we're looking for in reference to the definition of happiness and what makes us as a society want all the basic things we always talk about. And that's why I thought I would love the opportunity for Wendelijn to come in and talk today with all of my amazing listeners. Yes. Now, with these times and what you've been studying, and this is what I'm fascinated about, especially when we talk about, here in North America, we talk a lot about parity and, transformational leadership and stuff like that. We're obviously clearly showing that this has existed for centuries.
Yes.
That this has been, but through different political and religious ramifications. And like you said, literature got passed down based on the powers that were be. And then there's so many things that we're learning now since the 2000s. When you think about female leadership and think about what we're trying to achieve today, what kind of things would you say as a historian and someone that works with female leadership that companies or leaders of today really need to think about when they're thinking about women in leadership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, one of the most important things to start with is, again, to emphasize that these issues aren't new to think about. We have a legacy of actually thought leaders thinking about issues like this. So we don't need to invent the wheel all over again. And although we want to adapt solutions to the times of the here and now and our current issues, but it is really comforting to know that our current issues aren't really unique in the sense of sustainable leadership and issues with ethnicity and diversity and stuff like that. It's been a topic of discussion and thought for thousands of years. And I think it supports us, and it creates a starting point in which we can sort of relax a little bit. We don't need to think this is a whole new thing. No, it's in our DNA to want to try to cooperate and lead from a bigger perspective. And the thing that the second step that I often take is to make people and businesses aware that what we call thought leaders today were what philosophers were 2000 years ago. Philosophy wasn't sort of an elite individual exercise you did in your own study, like we think of philosophers nowadays, sort of a solitary, really intellectual endeavor. Now, philosophy was the sharing of wisdom with one another in thinking about themes as success and happiness. And for example, the Stoics, who I've been studying also for 25 years, were really adamant that to be successful as a society or individually, you needed to be in a happy place. And happiness was the sharing of what was good for the bigger good. So not on an individual level. They thought happiness couldn't exist if it existed only for the individual. So that's also really, really important to realize as sort of a second step. It is that to think about and have a broader perspective on leadership and what is success, what is happiness. I think that's all related. It's really important to know that that has been thought about also for 2000 years ago. And I think it's really interesting. I have here one of my favorite Stoics, who I've been rereading again since Rome. And I think is really interesting to know. This is an excerpt of a text from 2000 years ago, and it was a Stoic philosopher, Musonius Rufus, and he said about women, and then I go into what your question more in detail about the female issue, but I think this is really apt to start with. He says, someone might say that courage is an appropriate characteristic for men only, but this is not so. It is also necessary for women to be courageous and free from cowardice, so that she is overcome neither by pain nor by fear. And Stoics thought that pain and fear were the one things, or the two things that kept you from really fulfilling your purpose and being happy and therefore successful. And they say, so if women lack courage, it is from lack of practice rather than from courage not being an innate quality. And I think that's 2000 years old. That really is the bottom line for me in female leadership nowadays.
That's the bullseye, right? Like really technically, because it's for a lack of practice. It's not if you keep women or have kept women through the ages in those spaces based on the political or cultural context of that time, they haven't had the opportunities to be able to practice. And clearly what we're seeing today, that women have amazing transformational qualities that benefits so many things within companies. Yes.
And I think for women, we need two things to underpin this, what Musonius Rufus says. To make this a reality, we need to practice our courage as women, but we need men and women around us to give us the space to practice that courage. And we are responsible whether we take that space that is given to us. Like Amakia, there was just a little bit of space for her, but she ran with it, and she took it and she ran with it. And so it's up to us how to how we make use of the space that is given to us, but realize that courage is not something we have in spades without any practice. We need to practice that courage to bring to the table our type of leadership. Because I think, and I wrote about this as well last week, I think for women, a lot of the times, leadership is not so much leadership over, but leadership with. And that doesn't mean we enter sort of systems without hierarchy. It doesn't mean soft leadership, but I think leadership with others is really a different definition of leadership and power than leadership over. And that coincides with the three topics that sort of arose, or sort of learnings that I use in business lectures and workshops that arose from my research the second sort of key learning I always communicate is that these women 2000 years ago, if we can learn anything from them, it's that they really were very daring and skilled communicators in their representation of what they were and what they did in society. They did not shun away from expressing their roles in society. So yes, they put up statues with inscriptions naming what they did and what they had achieved. And that is something that I think we as women, we are sort of socially not, it's not a social ideal for us as women to really portray our strengths and communicate our accomplishments. But on the other hand, also in this case, we don't have the practice oftentimes in how to do that aligned to our characters, because it doesn't mean you have to be, I think that we have a lot of examples of how to communicate our accomplishments and roles from men, but for a lot of women, it just doesn't feel aligned with ourselves to express it like that. So we have to find our true expression of that. But I do think we have to express and communicate our accomplishments and our roles also to inspire others to be daring and to be courageous, to bring our hearts and leadership to the table.
And I think today in female leadership teams, you're seeing a lot more sponsorship, which I think previously, I think when I was in corporate, it was more, you felt like you're alone on an island generally because you're a minority as a female leader, and oftentimes other females were not your allies.
Yes.
Right. And so I think because that's, like you said, the backdrop was be like what I think I need to be to get ahead. And I can say that in the time, in present times, working with female leaders, they're so aware of what it's like with the legacy leaders that are, say, maybe recognizing they're in the last quarter of their career, that they are looking to help and always mentor, be, or be mentees. And so it's something that it's really nice to see now compared to, say, when I was, in corporate 20 years ago. It was a completely different thing, where in a way, sometimes you aligned, with males that were generally more accommodating than females, because there was that threat. So there was like a bit of the boardroom was like a battlefield, because women were trying to figure out, how do I have my voice heard without, losing my position? But sometimes the only option left for them were the male-dominated way to be able to approach.
Oh, yes. You experienced it, but I think I've seen sort of been on the tail end of it. And I've talked about this a lot, because I do see within my generation, sometimes women, well, not perhaps speaking badly, but not understanding why generations before us, and certainly the generation that has just retired, who are in their 70s, they've been sort of breaking the glass ceiling, so to say, but they had to use force and fit the mold. And they might not sort of understand what we are doing now and the sponsorship and stuff like that, but it has been needed. And I think it must have been really difficult, like for you 20 years ago, to sort of find your place and not lose your identity of who you are as a human being and your heart. And I think it would have been normal to sort of lose that at times, just to be able
to survive, to some degree to survive. You had to figure out the context, in your position to be able, and that wasn't all the time, but at times when you needed someone to align with you to help, sometimes that support wasn't there. And I think, when I think of us in Rome and all the amazing international leaders, from every generation, I mean, that we were in those rooms were with, just absolutely stunning. And I think of your philosopher, and I'm not going to remember his name, but it is so true when he says that what is needed is practice.
Yes. Oh,
Like
yes.
to drop those defenses, but to know that it's okay to drop those defenses to get the courage, because the courage is there.
Yeah.
And I think, what I experienced, and I think Kristen Envik is just one of a kind within.
Yes.
When I entered Rome, and met, all these women, there was an automatic courage
Yes.
that I could feel that everybody entered into and showed who they were as in their different capacities as leaders.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, I felt that too. And I thought it was also, the same goes also for the men who were there. I felt
Absolutely.
because
Yes.
it was really courageous for them to be a minority on their end for once. But I think there were more men than I had expected to, and they were really courageous as well. And what I really found as moving for me was that I knew that in my keynote lecture, I wanted to be personal and explain on a personal level what history had brought me in my life, and therefore as a leadership expert. But it was landing in Rome, getting to know this group of women, that I really dared to be courageous enough to be vulnerable on stage. And in return, I heard from women, so many women who said, "Oh, because you dared to be vulnerable on stage in the first lecture, I dared to be vulnerable at the table having the discussions." And I thought, but that's it. I was inspired by the dynamics of the group. It filled me up. It gave me courage. And because of it, it has a ripple effect, and it keeps
absolutely. And that's that, like you said, I think everybody wants to leave a legacy, period, men, women. And obviously with people like Ermakia, clearly she was saying, I'm gonna leave my imprint.
Yes.
And it shows you that, through the times that a lot of women did the same, but we just, are now learning about them. And I think it's become so very important that really from a company perspective, when companies are thinking about implementing policies, that they think about what you're talking about, the Stoics, because what do we want? We all want the same things, which is happiness and peace and meaning and purpose. And by applying the things that we're talking about with diversity and inclusion, we're talking just about making your workplaces happier. And I want you to talk a little bit, because I know you talk about happiness. What as a historian that you've learned about happiness and female leadership as well?
Well, I think what I've seen and what I find really interesting, and I will combine sort of the Stoic view with what I've deduced from my research on women in the Roman era, is that it's not only the Stoics, but the Stoics are a group of philosophers who have the most clear and practical sort of philosophy to use. It's not only an intellectual endeavor, they have a really practical philosophy. And they say success is based on the happiness of the individual and the happiness of the group at large. And for that, we need to live in alignment with what is either nature, God, and nature with a capital N, God, universal laws. They were sort of, they left it open. They did believe in gods, but they actually believed even more so in a universal law that regulated everything that was going on in life. So you needed to be in alignment with source, just to use a modern phrasing. And you needed to have a practice in which you were meditating daily, writing down in your journal your sort of daily aims, like don't want to. They were very much about handling your emotions and controlling your emotions in a way that you could create that happiness, so that emotions didn't override you in making your decisions every day. So they thought for that you needed to practice meditation, right? Be really aware of your actions and be really aware that how you act in society and in your own household, also in your own business, that how you act is in alignment with the aims you have, and that everything is geared towards that, and that it never is about an individual purpose and success. So for example, sort of having the goal of being as prosperous as you can, you are allowed to have that goal for Stoic philosophers, as long as you want to use that money for the greater good of all as well. You can have your money and live a good life, but be really aware that you use it for the greater good. So all the development of your inner skills and skill sets had to be for the greater good of all. There was no purpose for them in life in general to live it only for yourself. So it's a very very human in heart, I have to say.
Which is what I talk a lot with authentic heart leadership in my new book, right? It's about that alignment, like alignment to yourself and why you lead the way you do. And and going back to those core fundamentals about, why you became a historian, why you became a psychologist, and kind of making sure that you live that integrity, but it's not a means to an end back to you. It's to make, for the highest and best good.
Have a greater impact.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. And to come back to what you were saying about sponsorship as well, these Stoics were very much about supporting each other, and each other wasn't geared only towards men. The philosopher I just mentioned, Musonius Rufus, actually advocated that men and women were educated equally, because he says there's no point in sort of dealing with women as if they are inferior intellectually to men, because they simply aren't. So why not give them as good as educations as we give men? And that meant also a philosophical education. And what I see, that's a sponsorship as well, to have a really well-known philosopher talking about this. But what I saw, and I just spoke about the 3 key learnings that I deduced from my research. The third one is that what I see is that women really were networkers and great. They had female assemblies who were consulting and discussing topics and issues, and who were making decisions, supporting each other. And there were various types of associations for women, and it's not studied really broadly. But what we see is that outside of the city of Rome, we see a lot of various associations for women who were sort of a counterpart for the male senates who were running the cities. And these sort of female senates, just to put it like that, they did not have any political stature, so to say, but they were thinking about stuff, giving advice, solicited or unsolicited, it might have been, advice to the senates, and they were supporting each other. There was a sense of sisterhood that must have underpinned these gatherings. They had banquets together, and when this sounds sort of very theoretical, but when I apply it to Yamakia, I just told you about that really big tomb that she built. And we see in her tomb were not only her own family members who were buried in it, but we see a lot of other families of whom I also saw women in inscriptions sort of come to the surface when I studied. I did not only study Omachia in Pompeii, but all the women that I could find in inscriptions and statues and stuff like that. And we see a lot of these women, a couple of these women who were associated with her for one reason or another, and who were buried in that massive tomb as well. And those families weren't very different in social standing than she was. So it wasn't like she was sort of the most wealthy social layer on top of Roman society, and that the families that were buried in her tomb were sort of lower status. No, it was not like that. So it feels as if there was some kind of association type or system of, whether a sisterhood might be a bit too modern interpretation of it, but a support system for these families to also sort of participate in that massive status that was communicated through that enormous tomb of Omachia. So that support system and the sponsorship you were talking about,
which would make sense about what we're saying is necessary. It's almost like we're transcending time and bringing it forward, but really to some degree, it's about others helping others and having that support. And I think that's something that, a lot of times, that innate trait that women have, like they connect, they take care of systems around them, which would make a lot of sense when you talk about some of these systems of that time.
And I think to be even more concrete, when you ask for how does my research sort of correlate with the issues we have nowadays in D&I issues and sort of female leadership, I think the three key learnings I was talking about, when we as companies are daring to address these three key learnings, and I will just mention them in a minute, but I think it's a great starting point to facilitate sort of a space in which women can be courageous enough to develop their leadership, not only their leadership roles, but I think their own views and perspective on what type of leader they are or want to be. Because I think we really do need to be aware of what type of leader we are before we can be a leader. Or
you have to spend that time in awareness, which is such a big thing to know. How do I want to be perceived? What does my voice need to look like? Which I talk a lot with leaders on, being aware, like what is that message, like how are you in alignment, but spending that time to ensure that you're, like you said, you're good with yourself before you start to project what your leadership should be like out there.
Yes. And what I always say when I talk about these three key learnings, I think what we can really take away from these Roman women and sort of start a discussion. For example, if there's within a business, there's a manager or there's a CEO who wants to have the conversation with his female employers, or she wants to have a conversation with her female employers about their leadership, there are three key learnings I think that are really relevant. And the first is that these Roman women were really daring and innovative in the ways that they dealt with the legal and social limitation. And I think that's a great starting point to ask questions about, where do you feel limited? Internally and externally. It's not only externally, but internally. And I think as a psychologist, that must be really interesting. What are the limitations that you are aware of or need to be aware of, that you have sort of that limit you nowadays in your leadership capacities? And there are a lot of questions you can ask about that, because it might be really introspective, but it can also be that within a company, there are sort of unknown limitations or limitations for women that actually the company is not even aware of, that they perceive it as a limitation. So I think that's the first step a lot of businesses can take based on these Roman women. where do we feel limited as women in a company or in our lives as a leader? And the second is these Roman women were really, as I just mentioned, really skilled communicators of their accomplishments and roles. And we can ask women, how can we aid you in that? Is that something that you are aware of, that you can create your own ripple effect? It's not about sort of an egotistical thing in look at me and look at my CV and how amazing am I, but it's like you are a piece of the puzzle of society and a piece of the puzzle of a business. And if you're not clear on what piece of the puzzle you are, you're sort of corrupting the bigger puzzle, because you are a valid and valuable member of that puzzle. So start to ask questions on how, as a manager or a CEO, how are my female employees, how can we aid them in communicating their accomplishments, in communicating their roles, or becoming aware of that? Because a lot of the time it needs introspection as well to know who you are as a piece of the puzzle, and to know who you are in your leadership, to be a leader that is aligned with heart, as you say it. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is actually that, based on my Roman research, is that women were networkers and great networkers and sponsors of other women. And I think if we look at these Roman women who were setting up female assemblies, we need our sisterhoods, to put it like that. We needed, like in Rome, although of course we had men and women, it felt so supported, so incredibly supportive to have a lot of women around the table supporting each other. And actually, I think a lot of the women that I met, one of the few or the first things they would say was, how can I support you in your endeavors, in your journey? And I was sort of, what? What is happening? But it makes you fly.
Well, when you run into everybody and that's one of the first things they ask you, then you think, this is for real, right? Not like other conferences where it takes a while. It was definitely something that I absolutely experienced. So I think to your point, your third point, naturally through history, there has been that, and it's about as women getting back to our natural states, and what we're like in connecting and assisting and helping. Really, that comes, the way we're wired is we are wired to be the emotional keepers of relationships from a very, very young age. And naturally, not that men don't, but again, I think it's because it's the focus of our roles also in our families and our societies. So definitely I could see how number 3, which we experienced so well in Rome, was it at its highest sense. Yeah. And then it's those are such important steps. And it's amazing that you pulled that out from the research.
Yeah, it really, and it works for me as well. Like I shared in Rome on stage, when I do struggle in either my work or my personal life, I do look at these 3 points. Where am I struggling? Because a lot of the times I am not being very daring in how I am dealing with my limitations, or I'm not using my network, and or I'm not communicating my piece of the puzzle, my public roles and accomplishments, because the moment we start to do that, we sort of start to get the ball rolling again. And because when you feel stuck, you just need energy, or you need a different perspective, one little step at a time. And it works for me every time, I have to say.
Well, I'm going to keep that in mind as I go through some of the struggles that I have, which we can think about in any given week or month, how many of those struggles we might come up against to apply them. Now, I know I've taken so much of your time, and I know we could continue. I know you you do a lot of amazing work, and I would love for you to share with people if they'd like to get a hold of you to understand more about your book that you've written, or even the leadership work that you're doing, where they could reach out to have a chat with you.
That's lovely. Yeah, I'm as I explained earlier, in the middle of sort of redoing my website. So I would refer people to my LinkedIn page. And probably they are in the notes of the podcast, what my name is, and there aren't too many people with the same name, I can tell you. So they can absolutely contact me via LinkedIn, and I always love to get into contact with people who are interested in, well, either just to have a chat and be inspired, or get a nice reference for some literature or a thought or whatever. But I love working with companies mainly on leadership, and giving them a new perspective from based on history, because we don't need to invent the wheel again, as I said. And I am really committed to history, not for what it reveals about the past per se, but what it reveals about us, about our communities, about our businesses, and about the world at large. It breaks down some of the barriers we experience. And that is what I love to do. I love to focus on female leadership, but I do a lot of leadership work in general as well, with lectures, either in lectures or workshops.
That's amazing. And of course, the Wendelijn's contact will be in the show notes. So what am I walking away with? And I often say, look at where you've come from, so that you can know. Like you said, I love the molecule, of everybody that's impacted you. And I think of my legacy, and, coming from, Trinidad and Tobago, and, my path with my grandparents being indentured laborers coming from India and the Middle East, and where that is in my DNA, and what my path and what I've wanted to share with the world has been around voice. As a female leader. So as you go out there, just reflect on what Wendelijn's shared. She shared some amazing things, and to think about, how is it that you're going to be courageous? How is it that you are going to highlight who you are and where you want to go, and leverage your supports around you, because you have many. You may not have thought about it, and to think, what is one contact that I could reach out to today that might be able to help me make that first step in my practice, like the philosopher said. Start practicing today. And again, Wendelijn, thanks so much again for giving us your time, and for everyone listening, thanks so much for tuning in. Again, if you're wanting to know about leading from the heart, you can just go to my website, roxannederhodge.com/quiz. It'll give you a mini quiz. You can look at where you are, either at work, at home, and we'll send you the results. Again, Wendelijn, thanks so much, and loved meeting you in Rome, and I'm sure we will see each other again in Europe soon. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.